There comes a moment in every relationship, the breaking point, when your silence becomes louder than all the words you've ever spoken. And that's when they feel it. The avoidant, the one who pulled away, made you question your worth, kept you chasing, waiting, wondering, suddenly senses something's changed. You're not begging anymore. You're not trying to fix it. You're not there. And that's when their final dirty trick begins. They feel the power shift. For the first time, you're not orbiting around their emotional distance. You've stopped feeding the connection. You've stopped making excuses. You've stopped caring. And that terrifies them, because an avoidant doesn't fear losing you. They fear losing control. So they'll do what they do best. They'll test you. They'll reappear with subtle messages. Hey, just thinking of you. Or, I miss us. They'll remind you of the memories that once pulled at your heart. They'll act kind, gentle, maybe even vulnerable. And for a second it feels real. But here's the truth, it's not love, it's panic. They sense their grip slipping, and they'll twist the narrative to pull you back into the cycle. Not because they want to love you, but because they want to matter again. This is their final act. The illusion of change, the echo of connection, the emotional breadcrumb trail leading back to pain. And if you fall for it, you'll relive the same emptiness that made you walk away in the first place. But if you stand firm, if you stay silent, stay grounded, stay free, you'll see it for what it truly is, their last attempt to hold on to power they no longer deserve. The moment you stop caring is the moment you reclaim your peace. Their chaos loses its meaning, their silence loses its power. And for the first time, you win by not playing the game. So let them wonder, let them question, let them sit in the silence they created. Because the avoidant's final dirty trick only works on the person still craving closure. But you've already found yours. When you finally stop caring, something fundamental shifts inside you, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion and clarity. It's not that you stopped feeling, it's that you stopped fighting for someone who was never fighting for you. For the longest time, your emotions were the energy that kept the connection alive. Every text, every overthinking session, every attempt to explain your feelings, all of it gave them a sense of importance, a sense of control. They might have pulled away, acted distant, or gone cold, but deep down they still knew you cared. That knowledge was their quiet power. It kept them safe, knowing you'd always be there, waiting for the next moment of attention they decided to give. But the moment that changes, the moment your energy withdraws, something inside them panics. They don't necessarily want you back because they miss you. They want back the control they once had. When you cared, you reacted, you worried, you chased. You apologized for things that weren't your fault just to keep the peace. You tried to understand their silence instead of realizing it was meant to confuse you. You tried to hold the relationship together while they tested how far they could push you before you broke. When that dynamic ends, when you no longer rise to the bait, the air changes. You can almost feel them sense it. They might not even consciously understand what's happening, but they feel the loss of emotional control. That's when the games begin. The texts start coming in, small, harmless ones at first. Maybe a comment on something random. Maybe a memory they know will stir emotion. They'll try to spark a reaction, anything to remind themselves that they still matter in your world. But this time, you don't bite. You don't reply with the same warmth or confusion you once did. You might not reply at all, and that silence speaks volumes. See, the avoidant personality thrives on being needed while remaining unavailable. They're comfortable as long as they feel wanted but never vulnerable. Your care kept them safe from facing themselves. It reassured them that even if they didn't show up, you still would. But when you stop caring, that safety disappears. They're left with themselves, their choices, and the silence they once used to control you. That's when the discomfort sets in. They start to question what changed. They replay the moments in their head, not because they want to understand your pain, but because they can't believe they lost their hold. They might suddenly act interested, start conversations, or show curiosity about your life again. But the truth is, none of that comes from a place of transformation. It comes from fear. The avoidant's greatest fear isn't losing love, it's losing significance. When they realize they no longer have emotional access to you, they feel powerless. And for someone who's built their identity around emotional distance, that loss of control feels unbearable. That's the power shift. The moment the dynamic reverses, you stop orbiting around their silence, and they start orbiting around your absence. What used to drain you now fuels you. You begin to see that the power was never in their withdrawal, it was in your response to it. Once you stop feeding that system, it collapses. The balance that once kept you stuck begins to tilt in your favor. They might still reach out, they might still try to manipulate the situation, but now it feels different. You're no longer pulled by the same invisible strings. You realize that indifference is not cruelty, it's healing. It's the space where you reclaim your peace and no longer seek validation from someone who thrived on your confusion. And in that quiet, when you stop caring, they finally hear the echo of what they lost, not your attention but your power. When someone who is emotionally avoidant starts to realize that they no longer have the same pull over you, their first reaction is rarely love, it's control. The truth is, their behavior has never been about connection. It has always been about managing how close or how far someone can get from them. When you cared deeply, they felt powerful. They could disappear for days and still know you would be there, waiting with open arms, explaining away their distance, forgiving their inconsistency. That was the control they quietly fed on. The assurance that no matter how cold they became, you would still be warm. You were predictable, safe, and emotionally available. They could take without giving, and you would keep the balance alive because you believed love meant patience. But the moment you stop caring, the control dynamic collapses. You no longer rush to fix things. You don't explain yourself. You don't reach out after long silences. Suddenly, they can't predict you anymore. The script that once gave them security no longer works. This is when confusion and panic begin to surface for them. Not because they've realized your value, but because they've lost the emotional leverage they once had. It's not love they feel, it's the discomfort of losing dominance in the emotional dynamic. They begin to crave that control again. The validation that comes from knowing they still matter enough to affect you. An avoidant person's fear of intimacy isn't just about closeness. It's about losing power through vulnerability. When they sense you care, they hold back to maintain emotional superiority. But when you detach, they lose their position in that hierarchy. The silence they once used as a weapon now turns against them. Suddenly, you're the one who is unavailable, and they're the one waiting, watching, wondering if they still matter. That role reversal is their biggest fear, because it exposes something they've spent years trying to avoid: dependence. In their world, control equals safety. Being emotionally distant keeps them from feeling exposed. But when they lose control, they're forced to confront emotions they've buried: rejection, inadequacy, and the terror of not being enough. This is why they often come back when you've finally moved on. They'll use charm, nostalgia, or even vulnerability to re-establish a sense of significance. They might not even realize they're doing it. It's an instinctive reaction to the loss of emotional influence. They'll say things like, "I've been thinking about you," or "I miss what we had," not because they suddenly understand your worth, but because they want to know they still have access to your emotions. The irony is, they don't actually want to rebuild the relationship. What they want is to regain the upper hand, to feel like they still hold a place in your mind. Once they sense that power again, they often retreat, satisfied that the balance has been restored. This push and pull isn't a dance of love, it's a cycle of control. When you stop caring, you break that cycle. You no longer respond to their triggers or feed their need for reassurance. You stop giving them the reaction they depend on to feel powerful. And in that silence, their strategy falls apart. They start to question why their usual tactics don't work anymore. They replay conversations looking for signs that you still care. They might even act more open or emotionally expressive, but underneath it, the motive remains the same: to regain control over how you feel. Because to them, losing control means losing safety, and losing safety means facing their own emotional emptiness. That's the truth they've been running from all along. So when you stop caring, it isn't just an emotional withdrawal. It's a psychological shift that leaves them exposed. They're no longer the one deciding the pace, setting the tone, or defining the meaning of the connection. You've taken back the power they once held by realizing it was never theirs to begin with. And while they may interpret your detachment as coldness, it's actually the purest form of freedom. The moment you stop being part of their control game and start living from your own strength. Emotional breadcrumbs are one of the most subtle yet powerful manipulation tools an avoidant uses when they sense you're slipping away. They don't give you enough to build anything real, but they give you just enough to keep you hoping. It's a psychological trap disguised as care. The texts that come late at night, the random emojis, the sudden likes on old photos. These aren't coincidences. They are calculated emotional triggers meant to reignite the attachment you've been trying to let go of. Each small gesture feels harmless on the surface, but underneath it is a pattern designed to make you question your progress and reopen the emotional door you fought to close. When you've finally stopped reaching out, they start leaving traces of themselves in your path. They'll send a message that reminds you of a memory you shared, or ask a vague question that requires no real answer. The goal isn't to connect, it's to re-establish presence. They want to be in your thoughts again, even if it's just for a moment. The avoidant doesn't want full commitment because that requires vulnerability, but they also don't want to be forgotten. Emotional breadcrumbs allow them to have both. Distance without disappearance. It's their way of saying, "Don't forget me," without ever having to say, "I want you." This behavior can feel confusing because it mimics intimacy. A small act of kindness from them, a text saying they miss you, a compliment, a memory they bring up, can light up that old spark for a second. Your heart might want to believe it means change, that maybe this time they understand what they lost. But that's the illusion. They're not trying to rebuild, they're trying to maintain emotional relevance. As long as you still react, they know they still hold power. The moment you respond, even with something as simple as, "I hope you're doing well," you've given them what they were looking for. Confirmation that they still matter. Emotional breadcrumbs are the avoidance way of feeding on your attention without offering anything nourishing in return. You're left full of questions, analyzing every word, wondering if this is the start of something new or just another cycle of false hope. The truth is, it's the latter. If they truly wanted to reconnect, their actions would be consistent, their efforts steady, their words aligned with accountability. Instead, they show up inconsistently, enough to disrupt your peace, but never enough to build trust. They keep you emotionally suspended between closure and longing. What makes breadcrumbs so effective is that they appeal to your memory of who they were at their best. You remember the moments of connection, the laughter, the depth that felt so rare. So when they reach out even slightly, it feels like a glimpse of that person again. That's what keeps you hooked. But you're not responding to who they are now. You're responding to the ghost of who they once pretended to be. And that's how you stay stuck in the loop. They don't need to do much, just enough to trigger that old emotional response. Eventually, you begin to see the pattern for what it is. You start noticing that every time you begin to heal, they reappear with perfect timing. It's not fate, it's control. They can sense when you're slipping away, and their instinct is to pull you back in just far enough to stop your progress. It's a cycle of intermittent reinforcement, a powerful psychological mechanism that keeps you chasing validation. You remember the crumbs because they come after long stretches of silence, making them feel meaningful when really they're just a way to keep you emotionally tethered. When you stop responding to these breadcrumbs, something changes. The illusion breaks. They lose access to your emotions. You stop giving energy to something that never grows. And in that quiet space, you realize how much power those tiny gestures had over you. Not because they were grand, but because you kept believing they meant something they never did. Emotional breadcrumbs aren't connection. They're control disguised as care. Once you stop following them, the entire game ends, and all that's left is your peace. When an avoidant person suddenly starts showing interest again after you've detached, it's easy to believe that maybe they've had a change of heart. Maybe they finally understand your value. Maybe they finally feel the loss. Maybe this time they're ready to love you the way you deserved all along. But that isn't what's really happening. What looks like affection is often fear. What feels like love is really panic. It's the realization that their emotional control is slipping and that they no longer occupy the space in your life they once took for granted. It's not about missing you, it's about missing the power they had when you cared. An avoidance behavior is rooted in fear. Fear of closeness, fear of rejection, fear of losing their independence. As long as you were emotionally available, they could feel secure in their position. They could pull away when they wanted to, knowing you'd always close the gap. But when you stop caring, when you no longer chase, text, or wait, that fear flips. The control dynamic reverses. Now they are the one on uncertain ground, and unsure if they still have a place in your thoughts. That uncertainty feels unbearable for someone who thrives on emotional control. Their response to that fear isn't genuine connection. It's a desperate attempt to re-establish the old rhythm. So they reach out. Not because they've evolved or healed, but because they can't stand the silence. They'll send messages that sound tender or nostalgic. They'll remind you of inside jokes or moments you shared, hoping to reignite your emotional response. They might even appear more open than before, saying things like, "I've been doing a lot of thinking," or "I realize now what you meant to me." But if you look closely, their words don't match their actions. They're not showing consistency, vulnerability, or effort. They're showing anxiety. It's an emotional reflex, not a transformation. This panic-driven behavior is often temporary. Once they sense that you've softened, that you're emotionally invested again, the urgency fades. They've regained a sense of control, and with it comes their old avoidance. The messages slow down, the distance creeps back in, and before you know it, you're back in the same cycle that once drained you. It's not that they planned it consciously, it's just how they operate. Their comfort lies in the middle ground. Close enough to feel wanted, far enough to stay safe. The tragedy of this cycle is that it can feel like love when it's actually fear disguised as affection. You might interpret their sudden interest as emotional awakening, but it's really self-preservation. They're not trying to build a future with you. They're trying to manage their own discomfort. And they can't stand the thought of you moving on, because that would mean facing their own emotional emptiness. The reality that their actions pushed away someone who truly cared. So instead of doing the work to heal, they reach for the quickest relief, pulling you back in just far enough to feel significant again. This is why it's so important to recognize the difference between genuine love and panic-driven attention. Love is steady, intentional, and patient. Panic is impulsive, inconsistent, and selfish. Love wants to connect, panic wants to control. Love shows up even when it's uncomfortable. Panic only shows up when it's losing control. When you see their sudden interest for what it really is, you stop romanticizing it. You stop taking it as proof of growth and start seeing it as proof of fear. Their panic isn't your problem to fix. It's not your job to comfort someone who ran from your love only to return when they felt your absence. When you no longer react to their fear, when you no longer feed into their emotional game, you teach them something powerful. That your love is not a revolving door. It's not something they can step in and out of whenever it suits them. You become untouchable not because you're cold, but because you finally understand that their panic was never love. It was the sound of their control slipping away. Silence is one of the most powerful responses you can give when dealing with someone who thrives on emotional control. It's not about ignoring them out of bitterness or pride, but about reclaiming your peace from a cycle that no longer deserves your energy. When you finally choose silence, it becomes a language of self-respect, a boundary that says, I will no longer participate in my own pain. The avoidant person has always depended on your reaction, your texts, your explanations, your tears, even your anger. Every reaction, good or bad, reassures them that they still matter. When you go silent, that source of validation disappears, and the balance of power shifts completely. For a long time, your words were their safety net. You filled the gaps they created with reassurance. You reached out after arguments, apologized first, and tried to fix what they broke. You couldn't stand the tension, so you filled it with communication, hoping that if you just said the right thing, they would finally meet you halfway. But the avoidant doesn't fear your words. They fear your silence. Silence means they've lost control over the narrative. It means they can no longer manipulate your emotions through their hot and cold behavior. It forces them to face the emptiness they used to cover up with power. When you stop explaining yourself, when you stop reaching out, they start to feel something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. They can no longer predict what you'll do next, and that unpredictability makes them uneasy. For someone who uses emotional distance as a form of control, your silence is a mirror reflecting their own avoidance back at them. They begin to question if you've really moved on, if you've stopped caring, if you're talking to someone else. They may even convince themselves they don't care, but deep down, the quiet starts to eat at them. The silence becomes louder than any words you could have spoken. What makes silence so powerful is that it denies them the emotional reaction they expect. They're used to seeing you fight for them, defend yourself, or seek closure. They know how to navigate those moments because it keeps them in control. But they don't know how to navigate indifference. When you no longer respond, you're no longer playing by their rules. You're showing them, without saying a word, that you no longer need their validation. That realization stings more than any argument ever could. Silence is not passive, it's intentional. It's not about suppressing your emotions but redirecting them. Instead of wasting your energy trying to change someone who refuses to meet you halfway, you invest that energy into healing yourself. You start to see that your worth doesn't need to be proven through someone else's acknowledgement. Your silence becomes a form of power. Not because it punishes them, but because it frees you. It gives you space to detach, to think clearly, to rebuild the parts of yourself that were constantly seeking approval. Over time, they'll try to break the silence. They might send a text just to check in, or make small gestures that seem harmless. They want to test if they still have access to you. But if you stay grounded in your silence, you take away their ability to reopen the emotional wound. You stop feeding the cycle that once drained you. Every unanswered message, every unreacted moment, becomes a declaration that you are no longer available for half-hearted love or manipulation. Eventually, your silence teaches them something that words never could, that their absence no longer defines your peace. You've stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped fighting for something that only hurt you. In that stillness, you discover a strength that comes from within, not from their approval. Silence becomes your closure, your boundary, and your protection. It's the moment you stop waiting for their understanding and start living in your own calm. Freedom doesn't arrive the moment they leave. It arrives the moment you stop needing them to come back. Detachment is not about bitterness or revenge. It's about emotional liberation, freeing yourself from the constant pull of someone who could never meet you where you stood. For a long time, you believed closure would come through a conversation, an apology, or some grand realization on their part. You waited for them to see your worth, to acknowledge what they did, to finally give you peace. But real closure doesn't come from their words. It comes from your decision to stop waiting for them to change. It's the moment you realize that your peace doesn't depend on someone else's clarity. When you detach, it doesn't mean you stop caring overnight. It means you stop allowing your emotions to be controlled by their inconsistency. You stop checking your phone hoping for a message. You stop replaying old memories to make sense of what went wrong. You stop giving your energy to someone who made you feel like you had to earn love that should have been freely given. That's where freedom begins, in the quiet choice to protect your energy, to stop reopening wounds that will never heal if you keep touching them. At first, detachment can feel strange, even painful. You've been conditioned to believe that letting go means losing something valuable. But in reality, you're not losing them. You're losing the version of yourself that tolerated confusion and emotional chaos. You're shedding the part of you that kept waiting for validation. You're reclaiming the self that existed before the manipulation, before the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. This process isn't cold, it's courageous. It takes strength to stop chasing what's familiar and start trusting what's peaceful. Freedom through detachment also means accepting that not everyone will give you closure or accountability, and that's okay. The avoidant personality often runs from responsibility. They justify their distance, rewrite the story, or disappear completely. If you keep waiting for them to explain why they hurt you, you stay trapped in their emotional web. Detachment breaks that illusion. You begin to see that their behavior was never about your worth. It was about their fear of intimacy, their inability to handle connection. Once you understand that, you stop taking it personally. Their avoidance stops being your burden to carry. When you reach this level of emotional clarity, their attempts to reconnect lose their effect. The texts that once shook your resolve now look empty. The charm that once drew you in feels predictable. You can see through their patterns, not with anger, but with calm understanding. That's when you know you've detached, when you no longer need to respond, explain, or prove anything. You simply know your peace is worth more than another round of emotional games. Your silence isn't revenge, it's a reflection of your self-respect. Freedom through detachment also gives you perspective. You begin to realize how much mental space you gave to someone who didn't deserve it. All those sleepless nights, all that overthinking, all the effort to decode mixed signals, they lose their hold on you. The fog starts to clear, and you see how small they actually were in the grand scheme of your life. You stop romanticizing the connection and start recognizing the lessons. You see how it pushed you to set boundaries, to grow, to love yourself in ways you never did before. In this new space of emotional freedom, you no longer chase closure, because you've become your own closure. You no longer wait for love to come from someone who fears it. You start living without needing their approval, their attention, or their presence. You find peace in solitude, power in independence, and clarity in silence. That's the kind of freedom that can't be taken away, because it's no longer tied to someone else's behavior. It lives entirely within you. In the end, the avoidance final trick isn't about love at all. It's about fear. Fear of losing the control they once held, fear of facing the silence they created, fear of realizing that the person they kept at a distance has finally found peace without them. But what they never expected was that the very silence they used to control you would become the silence that frees you. You've learned that real strength doesn't come from fighting harder for someone who keeps walking away. It comes from walking away yourself, calmly, quietly, and with your head held high. You no longer chase understanding from someone who was never willing to understand you. You stop waiting for closure that was never theirs to give. You realize that you were never too emotional, too needy, or too much. You were just giving love to someone who didn't know how to receive it. And now you're different. You've stepped out of the game. You've reclaimed your peace, your clarity, and your self-worth. The storm that once lived inside you has settled into stillness. You've stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You've stopped breaking yourself into pieces for someone who never deserved the whole. That is what true freedom looks like. Quiet, steady, unshakable. So let them wander. Let them play their final tricks. Let them send messages that no longer shake your heart. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment you become untouchable. They may have once held your emotions, but now you hold your power. You've seen the cycle, you've felt the pain, and you've broken free. That's growth, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly unstoppable. The kind of growth that only comes from surviving something that tried to break you. And when you look back, you'll see it clearly. The ending wasn't a loss, it was your liberation. Goodbye and thank you notes. Thank you for staying until the end of this message. If these words reached you, if they helped you see your worth a little clearer, or reminded you of your own strength, then this wasn't just a speech, it was a conversation between two souls who understand pain and healing. Remember, your peace is your power, your silence is your answer, and your detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. Keep choosing yourself, keep walking forward, keep loving deeply but wisely. Until next time, stay grounded, stay kind, and never forget, you don't lose people who are meant for you. You only lose the ones who were meant to teach you. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for growing. Take care of your heart. It's finally yours again.